Books on architecture presents contrasts or a parallel between the noble edifices of the Middle Ages and corresponding buildings of the present day, showing the present decay of taste. By Augustus Pugin, 1836. Augustus Pugin was a pioneering architect and designer, renowned for his role in the Gothic revival movement. His work, including the design of the interiors of the Palace of Westminster, exemplifies his dedication to restoring medieval craftsmanship and aesthetics. In this seminal book, Pugin critiques the degradation of religious architecture following the Reformation, contrasting the splendor of Catholic designs with the perceived decline under Protestant influence. This audiobook has slightly updated language compared to the original to make it easier to follow for a contemporary audience. The text is unabridged and no meaning has been removed. The plates with the drawings from the book will be shown in the video but are not essential to following the book. A link to a PDF scan of the original book and the table of contents can be found in the video description. Please like this video to help the channel and subscribe to see similar content in the future. Thank you.
Preface to the second edition. The author is pleased to use the opportunity provided by the release of this edition to expand the text and correct some significant errors from the original publication. When this work was first published, the concept of Christian art was almost unknown, and the admirable works of Montalembert and Rio had not yet been written. It is not surprising that the author, standing almost alone in the principles he advocated, might have adopted some incorrect views while investigating a subject filled with so many perplexing difficulties. His theory was fundamentally correct, but it was not clearly developed. He accurately stated that pointed architecture was produced by the Catholic faith and destroyed in England by the rise of Protestantism. However, he was mistaken in treating Protestantism as a primary cause rather than an effect of a more powerful underlying force. Additionally, he erred in attributing the highest state of architectural excellence to ecclesiastical buildings. These are buildings constructed for religious purposes, immediately before the religious change. Although these buildings greatly surpassed the debased productions of the Elizabethan period, they still showed signs of the decay of true Christian principles. The real origin of both revived pagan and Protestant principles can be traced to the decayed state of faith throughout Europe in the 15th century. This decay led people to dislike and eventually abandon the principles and architecture rooted in the self-denying Catholic ethos, favoring instead the luxurious styles of ancient paganism. Religion must have been in a profoundly diseased state for these two monsters, revived paganism and Protestantism, to gain a foothold, let alone overrun the Christian world. It is unimaginable that a St. Ambrose or St. Chrysostom would decorate their episcopal residences with bacchanalian groups and illustrations of Ovid's fables, or that a St. Bede or St. Cuthbert would become Calvinists. If Henry VIII exceeded even Nero in tyranny and cruelty, the Catholic spirit must have been at an exceptionally low ebb. Had it not been, the Church of England would have risen in glory and purity, as persecution has historically strengthened the faith during times of vibrant belief. However, when the will of a schismatic king could so prevail over the entire clergy of this country that they erased St. Thomas of Canterbury, the Church's most glorious champion and martyr, from their missals and breviaries, and even eliminated the commemoration of the Holy Father himself, with only one bishop and a few abbots and priests remaining true to the faith, it was clear that England's church had miserably degenerated. Many scholars and unbiased minds now regard the so-called Reformation as a dreadful scourge permitted by divine providence as punishment for a decayed faith. Those who carried it out are now seen in their true light as church plunderers and crafty political intriguers, rather than holy martyrs and modern apostles. It is almost impossible for any sincere person to witness all episcopal and ecclesiastical power being completely controlled by a lay tribunal without condemning those who originally betrayed the Church. In our current divided and distracted state, a consequence of the Reformation, we are suffering severely for the sins of our forefathers. This is the only consistent view of the subject. England's church was not attacked and overthrown by a foreign enemy. It was consumed by internal decay. Her privileges and abbeys were surrendered by dissembling and compromising nominally Catholic ecclesiastics, and her revenues and glorious ornaments were despoiled and appropriated by so-called Catholic nobles. Both Protestantism and revived paganism were generated by unworthy men who bore the name of Catholic. The former is indeed a consequence of the latter. Strangely, there is a significant connection between the gardens of the Medici, filled with pagan luxury, and the independent preaching houses that now deface the land. Both are utterly opposed to true Catholic principles, and neither could have existed without the decay of those principles. When the great champion and martyr for truth, Savonarola, the Dominican monk, preached his first sermon in Florence, he predicted the desolation about to befall the Church. After powerfully describing the terrible danger in the then new rage for classical and pagan styles that were beginning to replace Christian art and feeling, he exclaimed, "By your continued study of these things and your neglect of the sublime truths of the Catholic faith, you will become ashamed of the cross of Christ and imbibe the proud, luxurious spirit and feelings of paganism, until, weakened both in faith and good works, you will fall into heresies or even infidelity." Who cannot see this terrible prediction fulfilled in the desolating religious revolution of the 16th century, which has led to the present divided state of religious parties in this country? Having clarified and corrected the errors he previously made, the author is ready to uphold the principle of contrasting Catholic excellence with modern degeneracy. Wherever this degeneracy is observed, whether in Protestant or Catholic countries, it stems from the decay of true Catholic principles and practices. It is important to note that many reviewers of this work have made a significant error by criticizing the author for selecting modern-style buildings to contrast with ancient edifices, when many better buildings have been erected in recent years in imitation of the pointed style. This objection can be addressed succinctly. Revivals of ancient architecture, although erected in the 19th century, are not buildings of the 19th century. Their merit must be attributed to the period from which they were copied. The architecture of the 19th century is characterized by an extraordinary conglomeration of classical and modern styles unique to the time, with no precedent in any previous era. Chapter 1, on the feelings that produced the great edifices of the Middle Ages. When comparing the architectural works of the last 3 centuries with those of the Middle Ages, the remarkable superiority of the latter is evident to any attentive observer. This naturally leads one to reflect on the causes behind this significant change and to trace the decline of architectural taste from its first decline to the present day. This will be the subject of the following pages. It is widely accepted that the true measure of architectural beauty lies in the design's suitability for its intended purpose, and that the style of a building should clearly convey its use to the observer. Acting on this principle, different nations have developed various styles of architecture, each suited to their climate, customs, and religion. Among these, religious edifices often stand out as the most splendid and lasting monuments. There is little doubt that the religious beliefs and ceremonies of different cultures had the greatest influence on the formation of their architectural styles. The closer we examine the temples of pagan nations alongside their religious rites and mythologies, the more we see the truth of this assertion. In these structures, every ornament and detail had a mystical significance. The pyramids and obelisks of Egyptian architecture, its lotus capitals, its giant sphinxes, and numerous hieroglyphics were not mere fanciful decorations, but emblems of the nation's philosophy and mythology. In classical architecture, the forms of temples dedicated to different deities varied, and specific capitals and orders of architecture were unique to each. Even the foliage ornaments on the friezes were symbolic. This principle of architecture, reflecting religious belief, can be traced from the caverns of Ellora to the druidical remains of Stonehenge and Avebury. In all these works of pagan antiquity, the plan and decoration of the buildings were mystical and emblematic. Is it reasonable to assume that Christianity, with its sublime truths and profound mysteries, would lack a symbolic architecture for its temples that would embody its doctrines and instruct its followers? Certainly not. In fact, Christianity has given rise to an architecture so glorious, so sublime, and so perfect that all the productions of ancient paganism pale in comparison. Pointed, or Christian, architecture has far higher claims on our admiration than mere beauty or antiquity. While beauty may be subjective, and antiquity alone does not prove excellence, this style uniquely embodies the faith of Christianity and illustrates its practices. The three great doctrines of Christian architecture are: 1. The redemption of humanity by the sacrifice of our Lord on the cross; 2. The unity of the three equal persons in one Godhead; 3. The resurrection of the dead. The first, the cross, is not only the very plan and form of a Catholic church, but also marks each spire and gable, symbolizing faith even in the altar's furniture. The second is represented in the triangular form and arrangement of arches, tracery, and even the subdivisions of the buildings themselves. The third is beautifully exemplified by the great height and vertical lines, which Christians, from the earliest times, have regarded as symbols of the resurrection. According to ancient tradition, the faithful prayed standing on Sundays and during the Easter season in reference to this great mystery. This practice is mentioned by Tertullian and St. Augustine. We pray standing, which is a sign of the resurrection. And by the last Council of Nice, it was forbidden to kneel on Sundays or from Easter to Pentecost. Given the vertical principle as a symbol of the resurrection, we can understand why Christians adopted the pointed arch to achieve greater height with a given width. The mere form of the pointed arch is of great antiquity, known even to Euclid. But it wasn't until the vertical principle was established that the arch came into use. Christian churches had previously been built with an eye toward internal height. Triphoria and clerestories existed in Saxon churches. Although these buildings were lofty compared to the flat and depressed temples of classical antiquity, the introduction of the pointed arch enabled builders to achieve nearly double the elevation with the same width. Do not all the features and details of churches erected during the Middle Ages reflect their origin and, at the same time, demonstrate the triumphs of Christian truth? Like the religion itself, their foundations are in the cross, and they rise from it in majesty and glory. The lofty nave and choir, with even taller towers crowned by clusters of pinnacles and spires, all directed towards heaven, are beautiful emblems of the Christian's brightest hope. The cross, raised high in glory, a token of mercy and forgiveness, crowns the sacred edifice and stands between the anger of God and the sins of the city. The images of holy martyrs, each bearing the instrument of their cruel death, line the arched recesses of the doorways, testifying to their enduring faith. Above them are cherubim and the heavenly host, mingled with patriarchs and prophets. Over the great entrance, scenes of the final judgment depict the divine majesty, the joys of the blessed, and the despair of the condemned. These majestic portals present profound subjects for contemplation as Christians approach the house of prayer, awakening reverence and devotion suited to the holy place. If the exterior of the temple is so soul-stirring, what a burst of glory meets the eye upon entering. A long, majestic line of pillars rises into lofty, fretted vaulting. The eye is lost in the intricacies of the aisles and lateral chapels. Each window beams with sacred instruction, sparkling with glowing holy colors. The pavement is a rich enamel, interspersed with brass memorials of departed souls. Every capital and base represents some holy mystery. The great rood loft, with its lights and images, frames the distant high altar blazing with gold and jewels, surmounted by a golden dove, the earthly tabernacle of the highest, before which burn 3 unextinguished lamps. It is indeed a sacred place. The modulated light, the gleaming tapers, the tombs of the faithful, the various altars, and the venerable images of the just, all combine to fill the mind with veneration and impress it with the sublimity of Christian worship. When the deep intonations of the bells from the lofty campaniles summon the people to prayer, and the solemn chant of the choir swells through the vast edifice, only the coldest heart could fail to echo the psalmist. Lord, I have loved the beauty of your house and the place where your glory dwells. Such profound effects can only be produced by buildings designed by individuals deeply devoted to and believing in the religion for which they were constructed. Their entire energy was directed towards attaining excellence, driven by far nobler motives than hopes of financial reward or public admiration. They knew they were engaged in one of the most glorious tasks possible. raising a temple for the worship of the true and living God. This sense of purpose motivated both the mastermind who planned the edifice and the patient sculptor whose chisel crafted each varied and beautiful detail. It enabled ancient masons, despite labor, danger, and difficulties, to persevere until they raised their gigantic spires into the clouds. It inspired the ecclesiastics of old to devote their revenues to this pious purpose and to labor with their own hands to complete the work. This unified purpose can be traced throughout the numerous edifices of the Middle Ages, and despite the great variety of genius displayed in their decorations, it consistently reflects the unity of purpose that influenced their builders and artists. They borrowed no ideas from heathen rites, nor sought decorations from the idolatrous emblems of foreign cultures. The foundation and progress of the Christian faith, along with the sacraments and ceremonies of the Church, provided an ample and noble field for the exercise of their talents. It is an undeniable fact that every class of artist who flourished during those glorious periods drew their inspiration from this inexhaustible source, devoting their greatest efforts to the embellishment of ecclesiastical edifices. It was the faith, zeal, and above all, the unity of our ancestors that enabled them to conceive and build those marvelous structures that continue to inspire our wonder and admiration. These edifices were erected for the most solemn rites of Christian worship at a time when the term Christian had a unified meaning throughout the world. The glory of the house of God was of paramount importance to mankind, and people were zealous for religion, liberal in their gifts, and devoted to its cause. I am well aware that modern writers have attributed the numerous churches built during the Middle Ages to superstition. However, if we believe in the fundamental principle of Christian truth, that this life is merely preparation for a future state, and that the most important occupation of man in this world is to prepare for the next, then the multitude of religious establishments during the ages of faith can be accounted for by far nobler motives than those generally ascribed to them. It may be argued, with some apparent reason, that if pointed architecture were the result of Christian faith, it would have been introduced earlier. However, a closer examination of church history reveals that the long period between the establishment of Christianity and the full development of Christian art can be satisfactorily explained. When the Catholic faith was first preached, all art was dedicated to the service of error and impurity. The severe persecutions of the early centuries utterly precluded its practice among early Christians. The convulsions following the fall of the Roman Empire, which temporarily destroyed all practical resources of art, also contributed to the barbarous state of architecture at that time. However, once Christianity had spread throughout Western Europe and infused its ennobling influence into the hearts of converted nations, art arose purified and glorious. Previously dedicated to gratifying the senses, art then ministered to the soul, and, exalted by the grandeur of the Christian mysteries and ennobled by its sublime virtues, it reached a level of excellence far beyond any it had previously achieved. Instead of being confined to the sensual or human, it was devoted to the spiritual and divine. Christian art was the natural result of the progress of Catholic feeling and devotion, and its decline was a consequence of the faith's decay. All revived classical buildings, whether erected in Catholic or Protestant countries, are evidence of a regrettable departure from true Catholic principles and feelings, as will be discussed in the following chapter. Chapter 2, on the revived pagan principle. The ancient pagans were at least consistent. In their architecture, symbols, and sculpture, they faithfully embodied the errors of their mythology. But modern Catholics have revived these profanities in opposition to reason, forming the types of their churches, paintings, and images from the detestable models of pagan error. These errors had been overthrown by the triumph of Christian truth. Yet, temples are now raised to the crucified Redeemer in imitation of the Parthenon and Pantheon. The Eternal Father is represented as Jupiter, the Blessed Virgin as a draped Venus or Juno, martyrs as gladiators, saints as amorous nymphs, and angels in the form of cupids. Translated from De l'état actuel de l'art religieux en France by M. Lecomte de Montalembert, Paris, 1839. If not for the overwhelming evidence provided by almost every edifice erected in the last few centuries, it would be hard to believe that after Christianity had completely overthrown the productions of paganism and its false doctrines, and when a new and sublime style of art had been generated by its holy and ennobling influence, perfectly suited to its faith and discipline, its followers in future ages would abandon this glorious achievement. Instead, they returned to the corrupt ideas of pagan sensuality that their ancestors in the faith had so triumphantly suppressed. Horribly, they even turned the most sacred mysteries of Christianity into a vehicle for this revival. Every church built from St. Peter's in Rome downward is a striking example of the departure from pure Christian ideas and architecture. Modern churchmen have adopted this debased style in all their new constructions, and they have scarcely left any of the glorious fabrics of antiquity unaltered by unsightly and incongruous additions. This mania for paganism is evident in all types of buildings erected since the 15th century: palaces, mansions, private houses, public buildings, and monuments for the dead. It even extended to furniture and domestic ornaments. It has invaded the ordinary forms of speech and is discernible in modern manners and government. The most celebrated palaces of Europe, like Versailles, the Tuileries, the Louvre, St. Cloud, Fontainebleau, Brussels, Munich, and Buckingham Palace, lack Christian emblems or ornaments. Decoration in gardens, terraces, entrance halls, vestibules, galleries, chambers, ceilings, panels, walls, windows, or pediments is invariably designed from heathen mythology. Gods and goddesses, demons and nymphs, tritons and cupids, all represented in flattering poses, reflect the tastes of the modern pagans, for whom sycophant artists designed these luxurious residences. In the new Buckingham Palace, whose marble gate cost an amount that could have erected a splendid church, there is not even a proper chapel provided for the divine office. Both in appearance and arrangement, it is entirely unsuitable for a Christian residence, forming a lamentable and degenerate contrast with the ancient palace of Westminster. The present unrivaled hall was the hospitable refectory, and the exquisitely beautiful St. Stephen's was the domestic chapel. That was a noble structure, worthy of English monarchs, with every chamber adorned with emblems of faith and country. St. George and St. Edward, depicted prominently, animated the English in sustaining many unequal fights with foreign foes. But these saintly names, famous in our national annals and once wrought wonders, have no charm for modern ears. Instead, we have pagan symbols like Victory or Minerva, while the standard of England is hoisted on a scaffold pole above a soot-stained mass of marble, misnamed a triumphal arch, a sorry substitute for the turreted gateways of the ancient palace. It is fascinating to observe the extraordinary change in the decoration of timber houses in French cities between the reigns of Charles VIII and Francis I. I have included engravings of 3 types of altars to illustrate my point. In the first, see plate number I, the true Catholic altar, every portion breathes purity and reverence. The sacred mysteries are depicted in a mystical and devotional manner, the figures full, draped, and modest garments, the devout and calm positions of the angels, the curtains, the embroidered frontal, the 2 candlesticks, and the cross, all in strict accordance with Catholic antiquity and feelings. In the second, see plate number 2, an altar used for Catholic purposes but of a debased and profane style, we see the fatal effects of revived paganism. The loose and indecent costumes and postures of figures intended as saints, but which are all concealed copies of the impure models of pagan antiquity, the classic details devoid of any appropriate significance, and the paltry and trivial taste of the ornaments, more suited to a fashionable boudoir than an altar for sacrifice, all demonstrate the total absence of true Catholic art ideas. In the third, see margin, the effect of the destructive or Protestant principles is depicted. The original imagery and tabernacle work of the altar screen have been mutilated and defaced. The altar itself, which had served for ages in the most holy mysteries and was covered with costly ornaments, has been plundered and demolished. An ugly, cheap table has been set in its place, where the book and basin indicate that it occasionally serves for baptism instead of the ancient font, which was likely repurposed for some menial task. The royal arms occupying the place of the Redeemer mark the temporal degradation of the suffering church, oppressed by civil power. In place of the original rich and splendid window, a few shattered fragments of stained glass are all that remain. These fragments will probably be discarded by the glazier in the next repairs, presenting a faithful picture of Protestant desecration and neglect. In England, as the succeeding pages will show, buildings have almost exclusively suffered through the destructive or Protestant principle. However, this was not a cause in itself, but the effect of Catholic degeneracy. We must view its ravages as the scourge of the decayed and compromising Church of England. Since the first edition of this book focused on this country, it is not surprising that I overlooked the revival of paganism and attributed the loss of Catholic art exclusively to Protestant opinions. I now readily retract my former error in this respect, and have endeavored to assign each principle its real share in the destruction of Christian productions. I was correct in stating that the excellence of art was only to be found in Catholicism, but I did not draw a sufficient distinction between Catholicism in its venerable form and as disguised in the modern externals of pagan corruption. However flawed my previous efforts may have been in principle, their intention, like the present work, was to exhibit the works and practices of Catholic antiquity as a far higher standard of excellence than any modern productions can offer. If people could view Catholic truth not as it appears today, or as it is distorted by popular prejudice, but in its ancient solemn form, what immense results might we not expect? Ordinary ideas in England about Catholicism, the pure faith of the merciful Redeemer, are associated with faggots, racks, inquisitions, tortures, daggers, poisoning, and all the horrors perpetrated by wretched, crafty politicians under the name and cloak of religion. Accounts of these, exaggerated and multiplied, are widely circulated. Conversely, the Church's practices and externals are so decayed today that it is difficult to show any place where its rites are celebrated with ancient solemnity. It is only by communing with the spirit of past ages, as developed in the lives of holy men and their wonderful monuments and works, that we can appreciate the glories we have lost and adopt the necessary means for their recovery. It is now time to break the chains of paganism that have enslaved Christians for the last 3 centuries, diverting the noblest powers of their minds from the pursuit of truth to the reproduction of error. Most modern antiquaries, painting schools, national museums, and collections have only corrupted taste and poisoned intellects by presenting classic art as the summit of excellence, substituting mere natural and sensual productions for the mystical and divine. Before true taste and Christian feelings can be revived, all current popular ideas on the subject must be completely overturned. People must learn that the so-called dark and ignorant period far excelled our age in wisdom, that art ceased when it was said to have been revived, that what is labeled superstition was piety, and bigotry was faith. Celebrated names and characters must yield to others currently obscure, and the famous edifices of modern Europe must be seen as deformed compared to the neglected, crumbling piles of Catholic antiquity. If the renunciation of preconceived opinions on these subjects and the resulting loss of current enjoyment are considered significant sacrifices, the new and glorious field that opens offers far more than an equivalent. What delight it would bring to trace a race of native artists, previously unknown, whose despised and neglected works exhibit the most mystical feeling and chaste execution, and whose beautiful compositions are the originals of many celebrated modern works. What exquisite remnants of sculptor's skill lie buried under green mounds marking once noble churches. What originality of conception and masterly execution can be found in the details of many rural and parochial churches. There is no need to visit the distant shores of Greece and Egypt to make discoveries in art. England alone abounds in hidden and unknown antiquities of surpassing interest. What madness, then, to neglect our own religious and national types of architecture and art, to worship at the revived shrines of ancient corruption, and to profane the temple of a crucified Redeemer with the architecture and emblems of heathen gods. The pagan monster, which has ruled so long and so powerfully over human intellects, is now tottering to its fall. Although its grip is too strong and its hold too powerful to be easily overthrown, its hideous form has been unmasked, and the strength of its assailants grows daily. Some desperate wounds have already been inflicted on the system. The great Overbeck, a prince of Christian painters, has established a school of mystical and religious artists who are putting to shame the natural and sensual school of art in which modern followers of paganism have long degraded the representations of sacred figures and events. In France, Le Comte de Montalembert, a man as fearless and unblemished as Savonarola the Dominican, has fully exposed the fatal effects of modern paganism on Christian feelings and monuments. His denunciations and exposition of Catholic art and truth have significantly improved taste and ideas on these matters. Various publications on the excellence of the despised Middle Ages have appeared, and many more are in preparation. Rio's work on Christian painting is an admirable production that will convert many to ancient art. In England, much has been done to restore Catholic antiquity, and a fine spirit has arisen in the head university itself. A society of learned men has been organized to study and preserve Christian architecture. The ecclesiastical antiquities of the country are considered worthy of patient research and elaborate illustration. Innovators are frequently denounced, blocked arches and windows are restored, whitewash is removed, and stained glass is reinserted. These are all promising signs for the future. Though those most active in reviving Catholic art are still few in number and are often seen as fanatics or visionaries, they bear any ridicule or criticism for their holy and glorious goal. On calm, dispassionate examination, where is the fanaticism and extravagance in asserting that art reached a far higher degree of perfection under the ennobling and purifying influence of the Christian faith than under pagan corruption? In considering the symbol of our redemption and the images of saintly figures more suitable to the residence of a Christian than the statue of a lascivious Venus or the representation of heathen fables, are they fanatical? In regarding the solemn chants composed by St. Gregory himself, sanctioned by repeated councils and universal antiquity, as better suited to divine psalmody and the offices of the Church than the extravagant compositions of infidel composers, are they fanatical? In preferring cloistered, quadrangled, and turreted edifices for collegiate purposes over long Italian pedimented mansions, are they fanatical? By following the architecture that emanated from the faith itself in the erection of churches, instead of adopting a bastard imitation of pagan edifices, unworthy and unsuited to so sacred a purpose, are they fanatical? In setting forth the self-denying, charitable, devout, and faithful habits of the ages of faith as far more admirable and exemplary than the luxurious, corrupt, irreverent, and infidel system of the present time, are they fanatical? Surely, if these be considered fanatical ideas, then Catholic truth itself must be fanaticism, for all these opinions are solidly based on it, and however much they may be assailed for a time, they must eventually prevail. Just as a warm climate is necessary for the existence of Eastern exotics, so is a Christian atmosphere essential for the faithful. The proverb, "Tell me what company you keep, and I will tell you what you are," holds true. Therefore, when I see a man professedly a Christian, who, neglecting the mysteries of the faith, the saints of the Church, and the glories of religion, surrounds himself with the obscene and impious fables of mythology and the false divinities of the heathen, I may presume, without violating charity, that although he is nominally a son of Christian Rome, his heart and affections are devoted to that city in the days of its paganism. Chapter 3. The Protestant Principle and the Pillage and Destruction of Churches under Henry VIII. The origin of what is commonly called the Reformation in this country is too well known to require much elaboration. However, it is necessary to say a few words to explain the rise of the Protestant or destructive principle. King Henry VIII, finding all his hopes of the pontiff's acquiescence in his unlawful divorce utterly dashed, resolved to free himself from all spiritual restraint of the Apostolic See. To this end, he had himself proclaimed the supreme head of the English Church. This arrogant and impious step incited the indignation of those who had the constancy and courage to prioritize the interests of religion over the will of a tyrant. These individuals boldly denounced the injustice and impiety of a layman claiming to be the supreme head of a Christian church. Their opposition, however, proved futile. A bitter persecution commenced against those who resisted this dangerous and novel innovation. Among the numerous victims who suffered were the learned and pious Bishop Fisher, Thomas More, and Abbot Whiting, whose fates exemplify the injustice and cruelty of this merciless tyrant. Having established his new dignity through rewards to those willing to comply with his will, and through threats of execution for those who dared to resist, the king found it necessary to replenish his coffers and secure the assistance needed for his sacrilegious projects. The step he took on this occasion led to the total overthrow of religion and paved the way for the disastrous events that followed. Since the first conversion of this country to the Christian faith, pious and munificent individuals had zealously established and endowed a vast number of religious houses. The labor of these houses, inmates, not only preserved and advanced literature and science, but also contributed to the conception and partial execution of great ecclesiastical buildings and their exquisite ornaments. Through the unwearied zeal and industry of these men, relieved from worldly cares and devoted to the sublime and admirable, their churches rose in magnificent splendor. Their almaries and sacristies were filled with sacred vessels and sumptuous vestments, and their libraries groaned under the weight of ponderous volumes, each requiring years of intense application to produce. It would be endless to elaborate on all the advantages accruing from these splendid establishments. Suffice it to say, their boundless charity and hospitality fully maintained the poor. They served as places for the instruction of youth and as retreats for mature age. The vast contributions of the monastic bodies to all classes of art and science demonstrate the excellent use they made of their time, not consecrated to devotion and the immediate duties of their orders. To a monarch who neither respected sanctity nor art, these institutions only offered a lure to his avarice and a means to replenish his exhausted treasury. Disregarding the consequences of such a sacrilegious step, he exercised the power of his newly acquired headship to appropriate lands dedicated to God, which had supported the religious, the learned, and the poor for centuries, for his own use. He accomplished this change by instituting commissioners for the pretended reformation of ecclesiastical abuses, but in reality, to achieve the complete overthrow of religious houses. This was done by fabricating accusations of irregularity and executing those who opposed his intentions on the grounds of denying his supremacy. Through these means, he obtained an act of Parliament to suppress all houses whose revenues were 300 marks a year and under. This monstrous measure, which dissolved 376 conventual establishments and scattered an immense number of religious persons, was merely a prelude to a larger suppression. This subsequent act led to the complete dissolution of all larger abbeys and a significant number of colleges, hospitals, and free chapels. Baker, in his Chronicle, estimates the number of suppressed institutions to be 645 monasteries, 90 colleges, 100 hospitals for the poor, and 374 chantries and free chapels. All the lands and an immense treasure of ecclesiastical ornaments were appropriated by this rapacious and sacrilegious tyrant, leaving the rightful possessors utterly destitute. This measure was a fatal blow to ecclesiastical architecture in England. From this period, we witness a series of destructions and mutilations, where the most glorious edifices of the Middle Ages were either entirely demolished or so severely altered that the remnants only serve to remind us of what is forever lost. With the slaughter and dispersion of the religious, all the buildings then in progress were immediately stopped. A vast number of their former inmates fled to foreign lands where the ancient faith remained inviolate. Those who stayed behind, reduced to poverty, became humble suitors for the charity they had so often bestowed on others. With bleeding hearts and bitter lamentations, they watched as the edifices they had labored over were consigned to rapacious court parasites as rewards for groveling submission or through chance in gambling. They witnessed the lead being torn from the roofs and spires of their venerable churches to satisfy the wasteful extravagance of a profligate court. The beauteous and precious ornaments that had enshrined the relics of departed saints, or served for centuries in the most solemn rites of the Church, were reduced to mere masses of metal under the fire of the crucible. Their libraries were pillaged, their archives destroyed, and the remains of their illustrious dead were torn from their tombs and treated with barbarous indignity. The suddenness of these events meant that many buildings were demolished before the cement binding them had even hardened. Many a mason, whose chisel had wrought beautiful forms, lived to see his labor mutilated by the axes of the destroyers. The impact of these scenes on the remaining clergy in cathedrals and other churches is easily imagined. Apprehensive of a similar fate to their monastic brethren, they were paralyzed, and no further efforts were made to beautify the edifices they expected to be plundered soon. They waited in dreadful suspense for the next step the sacrilegious tyrant would take when either his avarice or necessities prompted him. It is a common error to suppose that the change of religion in this country resulted from popular sentiment. On the contrary, the masses were warmly attached to the ancient faith. The truth is that the great fabric of the church was undermined gradually, one step leading to another, until, like all revolutions, it far exceeded the intentions of its first advocates. I believe that had Henry foreseen the full extent to which his initial impious step would lead, he would have been deterred by the dreadful prospect from proceeding. He was the father of persecution against Protestant tenets in this country. By his 6 articles, he confirmed all the leading tenets of the Catholic faith, and the only alteration he made in the Mass was erasing the prayer for the Pope and the name of St. Thomas à Becket from the missals. Images were retained in churches. The sacrifice of the Mass was offered everywhere in the usual manner, and the rites of the old religion were performed, with the difference that their splendor was greatly reduced due to the king appropriating the richest ecclesiastical ornaments for his own use. Thus, Henry cannot be considered a reformer, except insofar as his inclination for plunder and demolition aligns him with that group. In no other respects did he resemble those who later built on the foundation he laid. He foolishly imagined he could seize the church's wealth and power and maintain the same unity and discipline as those who held it by apostolic right, but he was grievously disappointed. The suppression of religious houses and the desecration of shrines and places long considered sacred raised doubts and uncertainties among people that were more easily excited than suppressed. The exercise of private judgment in matters of faith and various heretical works imported from Germany fostered irreverence for the clergy and contempt for religion. This was exacerbated by the daily innovations made by those in power regarding the rights and property of ecclesiastics. Henry lived to see and lament that neither his executions nor his punishments could preserve unity of creed. The great spell that had held men together was broken, and they were as unwilling to be restrained by his rules as he had been by the ancient faith he had abandoned. During his life, the cathedral and parochial churches suffered little, except for the loss of their richest ornaments. All the destruction fell on the monastic edifices, and it was not until his infant son, Edward VI, ascended the throne that the true impact of the new opinions was displayed, and the work of robbery and destruction fully commenced. Chapter 4. The destruction of churches, during Edward VI's reign and the establishment of Protestantism by law. Disastrous as the latter part of Henry's reign proved to religion and ecclesiastical architecture, the succeeding reign of Edward VI was doubly so. The church in this country had as its supreme head a boy of 9 years old, incapable of thinking or acting for himself, and fit only to be used as a mere tool by those who actually constituted the government. These governors were, unfortunately, men who viewed church property solely as a legitimate source of plunder. Fearing that a restoration of the ancient religion would not only prevent further enrichment, but might compel them to return what they had unlawfully obtained, they resolved to establish a new system entirely dependent on the temporal power. This system would allow them to pillage with impunity. They aimed to abolish the grand and noble accompaniments that had rendered the sacred rites of religion so solemn and imposing for centuries. By doing so, they could seize all those ornaments, reduce a large number of the clergy, and even demolish vast portions of the buildings themselves, either to use the materials or benefit from their sale. To achieve these ends, old bishops who would not consent to the impoverishment of their sees were displaced, and their bishoprics were filled by men willing to surrender large portions of their temporalities to those in power to obtain positions they had no legitimate right to, and little reasonable expectation of ever possessing. Cranmer, the perfidious and dissembling archbishop, who had outwardly conformed to the old system during Henry's lifetime, now revealed his true colors. Declaring himself an enemy to what he had professed all his life, he surrendered half the lands belonging to the See of Canterbury to ingratiate himself with the day's favorites. All the church lands were similarly reduced and appropriated to enrich the nobility's estates. The spoliations were not confined to landed ecclesiastical property. The Protector, Somerset, conceived the idea of erecting a sumptuous mansion in the Strand and caused the demolition of the magnificent cloisters of St. Paul's, the nave of St. Cleeth, Bartholomew's Priory Church in Smithfield, which had just been completed, 5 churches, and 3 bishops' palaces for materials, demonstrating the new churchman's lack of veneration for religion or art. This further proves the absence of respect for buildings dedicated to religious worship when the Lord Protector, the nominal supreme head of the English Church, demolishes large portions of the Metropolitan Cathedral and numerous ecclesiastical edifices to gratify a mere whim. To continue this devastation and robbery under the guise of restoring primitive simplicity and abolishing superstition, acts were passed to deface images, pull down altars, and seize all ecclesiastical ornaments that had escaped Henry's commissioners or had been left as necessary for performing rites in the ancient manner. Churches were cleared out so thoroughly that only 1 chalice and paten remained in each. The lay reformers took great pains to ensure that none of the new rites and ceremonies were irksome or expensive or impeded their ongoing plunder by introducing anything valuable or imposing. From the moment the new religion was established, the great ecclesiastical edifices ceased to be of real utility. The new rites could have been performed in a capacious barn. Still, the reformers' policy led them to leave a few buildings and retain some old titles to secure the lands and oblations which they thought impossible to retain and collect without some semblance of tradition. This pragmatic approach is why we still have the cathedrals we see today. Do not imagine, reader, that it was the wonders of their construction or the elegance of their design that preserved them. It was not the loftiness of Salisbury's spire, the vastness of Ely's lantern, the lightness of Gloucester's choir, or the solemn grandeur of Wykeham's nave at Winchester that spared them in the general havoc. There are crumbling remains scattered across the country, marking where once stood churches as vast and fine as those we now behold. Glastonbury, Crowland, Reading, St. Edmunds, and many others were not inferior in scale or grandeur. They contained tombs of illustrious dead, shrines, and chapels replete with works of wondrous skill. But they are gone, condemned to ruin and neglect. They perished piece by piece, and all that remains are unshapen masses of masonry, too firmly cemented to make their demolition profitable. We would see the cathedrals in a similar state now if not for the reformers' decision to preserve just enough of the old system to serve the new. These reformers, despite professing to revive apostolic simplicity in all matters entailing expense or duty, were unwilling to imitate apostolic poverty. They did not object to popish titles like dean, canon, or prebend, because these came with good incomes, though such dignitaries are not mentioned in Holy Writ, which should have been an insuperable objection for those rejecting church tradition. But an altar, entailing considerable expense for its daily lighting and decoration, and rich appendages providing substantial plunder, was condemned to be replaced by a common table, supposedly more agreeable to apostolic use. Why did these restorers of simplicity not meet in upper rooms as the apostles did? Because they would have had to renounce claims to church lands. Instead, they sat content in the same stalls and choir as their Catholic predecessors. In this manner, the work of destruction and theft continued. Somerset's demolition of ecclesiastical buildings for his mansion is a prime example of the lack of respect for religious structures. The spoliation was masked by the pretense of returning to primitive simplicity, but in reality, it was about enriching the reformers at the church's expense. This period marked the end of the grand ecclesiastical edifices' real utility, and their preservation was not due to their architectural merit, but rather the reformers' practical need to retain church lands and income. This is only one among the many inconsistencies that attended the foundation of the establishment. I mention it to show the base and sordid motives responsible for the partial preservation of what remains, and how little any feelings except those of interest and expediency played a part. I have described the dreadful results produced on the buildings by the combined ravages of avarice and fanaticism. Now, I will show how materially they continued to suffer when the new system was finally established by law. The altars had everywhere been demolished. The stained windows in many places were smashed from the mullions they had so brilliantly filled. The images of saints were left headless in their mutilated niches or utterly defaced. The cross, that great emblem of human redemption, was trampled underfoot. The carved work was broken down, the tabernacles were destroyed, and the fabrics were denuded as much as possible of those appearances, indicating their dedication to the solemn offices of the ancient church, left as bare as the strictest disciple of the Genevan church could desire. Plunder was nearly over. All that was rich and valuable had long disappeared. Even brass was becoming scarce, and the leaden coffins of the dead had been so exhausted that they could rarely be found to supply the melting pot. Further excesses were forbidden. The buildings were declared sufficiently purified of ancient superstition. The axe and hammer were laid aside, and the shattered edifices were subjected to a second ordeal, almost as destructive as the first, in being fitted up for the new form of worship. Reflecting on the horrible repairs, alterations, and demolitions that have taken place in our venerable edifices, often directed by a tepid and parsimonious clergy, brutal and jobbing parochial authorities, and ignorant and tasteless workers, I do not hesitate to say that lovers of ancient art have more to regret during the period that the churches have been used for their present purposes than even during the fatal period in which they were first desecrated. The manner of preparing the churches for the new liturgy involved blocking up the nave and aisles with pews, or dozing pens. Above this mass of partitions rose a rostrum for the preacher, reader, and respondent, while a square table surmounted by the king's arms, replacing the crucified Redeemer, concluded the necessary erections. These were as unsightly as the ancient arrangements were appropriate and beautiful. Had propriety and fitness been considered instead of economy, the old churches would have been abandoned altogether, and places of worship erected very similar to the dissenting chapels of the present day. All that was required, and indeed most appropriate for Protestant service, was a large room, well aired and well ventilated, with a pulpit situated so that all the congregation could hear and see well, a communion table in the middle, and 2 or 3 tiers of galleries to cram a large auditory into a small space. The old buildings are the very reverse of this, and totally unfit for any worship but that for which they were erected. Yet there they were, and fitting or not, they were used for the new service, leading to all the incongruities we see in ancient parochial churches. The aisles were cut to pieces by galleries of all sizes and heights. The nave was blocked up with pews. Screens were cut away. Stalls were removed from their old positions in the chancel and set about in odd places. Chantry chapels were turned into corporation pews. Wooden paneling of execrable design, smeared with paint and inscribed with the creed and commandments, entirely covered some fine tabernacle work, the projecting parts of which had been cut away to receive it. Large portions of the church, for which there was no use, were walled off to make the preaching place more snug and comfortable. Porches were enclosed and turned into engine houses, and a host of other wretched mutilations occurred. When all was done, these buildings remained inconvenient and inappropriate for the purposes they were used for. These enormities were not confined to obscure villages or large parochial churches. Equally vile abominations, and far more reprehensible due to their perpetrators' education and status, are found in collegiate and cathedral churches, which are under the control of the highest class, as well as in those managed by the ignorant. I have now shown how the fall of ecclesiastical architecture in this country is intimately connected with the growth of Protestant principles. I first showed the halt it received through the destructions of the rapacious Henry and the utter loss of the feelings that had carried it on successfully for many centuries. I then exhibited how avarice and fanaticism, both produced by the new opinions, instigated the plunder and destruction of all those splendid ornaments which, under the fostering care of the ancient faith, enriched and embellished every sacred pile. Further, I have shown the base and sordid motives responsible for the preservation of what remains. Lastly, I have shown that to render the churches available for the new system, many of their grandest features were destroyed, and their ancient and appropriate arrangements violated. There is one more result I have not yet described, but it is one of the most dreadful, the most disastrous, and one which effectively prevents the possibility of achieving great ecclesiastical works. It is the entire loss of religious unity among the people. When the common prayer and articles were set forth, heavy fines were imposed, and even death inflicted, on those who did not receive them as the only rule of faith or form of religious worship. By such means, men were driven into an outward show of uniformity for a short time. But where was the inward unity of soul? Where was the faith that had anciently bound men together? Alas, that was utterly fled. Where were the spontaneous offerings, the heartfelt tribute, the liberal endowments by which the ancient church had been supported, and the glorious works achieved? The scene was entirely changed, and not only had these feelings ceased, but even the most necessary repairs of those buildings, which had been raised in splendor by the voluntary offerings of the people, were only effected by rates wrung by fear of law from unwilling parishioners, 2/3 of whom equally detested the form forced upon them, and which they were compelled to support. No longer were village priests looked on as pastors of the people, nor those high in ecclesiastical authority with veneration and respect. The former were considered only as collectors placed to receive dues they were compelled to pay, while the latter were eyed with jealousy by the avaricious nobles and regarded by most people as a useless class of state officers. The increase of these feelings within 1 century of its establishment caused the overthrow of the new religion and the entire suspension of its rights during the rule of the usurper Cromwell, a period of English history too well known to need elaboration. These same feelings attended its revival with the restoration of the Stuarts and are openly manifested by a vast body of people even today. It is important to note that much of the dreadful devastation described in this chapter was caused by the rapacity of the government or temporal power into whose hands Cranmer and his apostate associates had betrayed the clergy of the Church of England, who were compelled to be passive spectators of their own ruin. Even those who framed the new liturgy had no intention of making a wide departure from ancient Catholic practices. But once drawn into the vortex of innovation, they were forced on by the Calvinistic faction, which profited by the confusion, stripping the defenseless church of its solemn rights to better plunder its revenues. Many holy and venerable customs were weakly surrendered in the vain hope of inducing these heretics to conform, but as expected, with miserable success. For today, dissenters clamor as loudly against the poor shadow of ancient discipline that has been preserved as they did against the solemnities of the Church in all her ancient glory. Chapter 4. The current degraded state of ecclesiastical buildings. Let's now examine the current state of ancient ecclesiastical buildings after centuries of devastation, neglect, and poor repairs. Starting with cathedrals, which are the most splendid remnants of the past, it's clear they deserve our first consideration. Anyone well-versed in ecclesiastical history and who has traveled across the country to study these magnificent structures will initially feel astonishment and admiration. However, these feelings quickly turn to regret and disgust when one sees how much of these buildings has been defaced and how unfit the current occupants are for such noble edifices. When these grand churches were originally built, every part of them had a specific purpose. The choir was reserved solely for the clergy, each occupying their designated stalls. The nave was meant for the congregation, a mix of all ranks and wealth, gathered together for the worship of God. The aisles provided space for the clergy's solemn processions. Various chapels, each with its altar, allowed different priests to say masses at successive hours from early morning, ensuring everyone could find time for religious duties. The cloisters offered a quiet, sheltered space for the clergy's meditation, and the chapter house served as a noble chamber for meetings on spiritual and temporal matters. These churches were closed only for a few hours at night, remaining open for private prayers and supplications. But what is their use now? Are their doors ever open to the devout? No, except for brief periods twice a day for worship, the gates are firmly closed, and entry requires a fee to the guardian of the keys. If you ask why, the answer is that if left open, the churches would be defaced and desecrated. If this is true, what does it say about the moral and religious state of a country where churches must be locked to prevent their desecration? How far have we fallen from the ancient devotion and piety? In fact, feelings of private devotion are so lost that if someone were to kneel in prayer at any time other than the designated service, or in any part of the church other than the designated area, they would likely be seen as insane and possibly asked to leave. No, cathedrals are now visited for entirely different reasons. The first group includes those who live nearby and attend services out of routine. The second group comprises those who have no interest in prayers but enjoy the music and drop in to hear the anthem. The third group is tourists, who visit to see the church among other sights, reading epitaphs, thinking it's pretty, and then quickly moving on. The fourth group visits during special events like fairs or assizes, usually in groups, to see the big church built by the old Romans after seeing other attractions. These groups, for the most part, do not feel the sanctity of the place or appreciate the majesty of its design. Few are moved by the mutilated yet still admirable designs. Few can conjure up in their minds the glory of these buildings' past greatness. These individuals who bitterly despise the heartless throng that simply gazes about the sacred aisles mourn the loss of the ages of faith that produced such mighty and glorious works. They acutely feel the barren, meager, and inappropriate uses to which these edifices have been put. To them, the modern clergyman seems truly despicable as he moves from the door to the vestry, goes through the prayers, and then quickly leaves, forming the greatest contrast with the noble works that surround him. What connection does he have with the ecclesiastics of ancient days? Do we see him, after the public service is concluded, kneeling in silent devotion in some chapel? Do we see him studying and contemplating in the vaulted cloisters meant for meditation? No, he only enters the church when his duty compels him and leaves as soon as he can. He sees the building merely as a source of income. Religion is his trade. Yet these men, cold and callous, insensible to any spark of ancient zeal and devotion, dare to speak with contempt of the glorious spirits who founded these establishments. They owe their incomes to the pious munificence of these founders, yet they condemn and ridicule the faith that inspired such generosity. Have they no gratitude? No, they regularly publish revilings, falsehoods, and libels about the religion and faith that instigated the very foundations and endowments they enjoy. They pretend to admire the fabrics raised by that faith while condemning and ridiculing its cause. Can we hope for any good results while such men as these use, or rather possess, these glorious buildings? These are men who either let the churches decay through neglect, or, when they do spend some money, end up causing more harm with their inappropriate and absurd alterations. For example, the so-called improvements made by Bishop Barrington at Salisbury, executed by James Wyatt, deserve severe criticism. During this improvement, the venerable bell tower, a grand and imposing structure on the northwest side of the church, was demolished, and the bells and materials were sold. The Hungerford and Beauchamp chapels were pulled down, and the tombs were set up in a mutilated manner between the pillars of the nave. There were countless other barbarities and alterations too numerous to list. Similarly detestable was the removal of the ancient tracery and glass from the great eastern and aisle windows of St. George's Chapel, Windsor, replacing them with the tame and lifeless designs of the painter West. These designs are disgraceful in any context and become even more contemptible when substituted for the masterful arrangements of the original architect. Wherever we go, we find that whether the buildings have been neglected or attempted to be improved, both outcomes are disastrous. It cannot be denied that these edifices are completely unsuitable for the current practices of the establishment. They lack the comfort now so highly valued and, since the choir has been repurposed as a parish church, are desperately short of seating. To gain more space, the ancient features are being rapidly swept away. It is disheartening to enter the choir of a cathedral church and see the stalls, nominally reserved for church dignitaries, occupied by all sorts of laypersons. Sometimes the bishop's throne, the cathedra itself, is taken by some important-looking lady in the bishop's absence. Propriety and decorum are entirely lost in these churches. Without the presence of a few singing men and boys and a solitary residentiary peeking above his cushion, one might think the gathered group to be a congregation of independents temporarily using the choir for preaching. Then there's the rush at the end when singing men, choristers, vicars, and people all make a simultaneous movement to exit the choir door, creating a scene of disgraceful confusion. This chaos stems from abandoning the ancient practice of reserving the choir solely for ecclesiastics. The new church leaders allowed people in to hide the deficiency of absent clergy. This led to the installation of pews in choirs, one of the vilest mutilations the cathedrals have ever suffered. The alterations recently made in Peterborough and Norwich cathedrals serve only to destroy the appearance of a choir, filling the center with pews and seats and reducing the grandeur of the open space to a narrow aisle leading to boxes. Covering the fronts of these seats with tracery and paneling is in vain. The principle is flawed, and any attempt to mask it only highlights the defect. This depiction of the modern state of cathedrals is strong but accurate. Anyone can verify its truth by inspecting the buildings and observing how services are conducted. Take, for instance, the remarkable church at Ely. The result of neglect is evident. Water pours through unclosed apertures in the roof, causing ruin within the fabric. The opening fissures of the Great Western Tower are rapidly widening, unnoticed and unheeded. The chapter house, once grand, is now filled with pews and shoddy fittings from the parish church that the chapter refused to repair. The matchless canopies have been pared down and whitewashed. The whole church is in decay, despite Ely still being wealthy in its revenues. What must be the hearts of the men forming this chapter? They are, unfortunately, typical of many others. Ely is cited specifically because it is one of the most interesting churches in existence and is in a particularly dreadful state of repair. The same observations apply to most of the other great churches. Take Westminster Abbey, for example. It is by far the finest edifice in the metropolis, but it is in a lamentable state of neglect. The abbey is continually being disfigured by the erection of more inappropriate and tasteless monuments. Recently, when examining the interior of this magnificent church, I was utterly disgusted to see that the chapel of St. Paul had been half filled with a huge figure of James Watt, sitting in an armchair on an enormous square pedestal adorned with tasteless ornaments. These ornaments, unlike any Greek or Roman foliage, were presumably intended to be Gothic. This eyesore is the work of Sir F. Chantry. Surely, this figure must have been originally intended for the center of some grand terrace garden. It could never have been meant for the interior of the abbey. Its presence is so offensive that if Sir Francis did indeed design it for this location, he deserves to be crushed under its great pedestal to prevent him from committing such an atrocity against good taste again. But is this noble edifice to be forever blocked and mutilated by the continual erection of these most inappropriate and tasteless monuments? Do the dean and chapter not have sufficient authority to prevent their erection? What can we expect or hope for from them when they allow filthy dolls to be exhibited within the sacred walls to make the showplace more attractive to holiday visitors? O spirits of the departed abbots, if only you could see this! The mighty buildings you raised, the tombs of the great men that lie within them, all this is not enough to attract the mob, so a set of puppets is added, the show draws in visitors, and the chapter collects the cash. Oh, vile desecration! And this occurs in the largest church of the metropolis, the mausoleum of our kings, a place of the highest interest because of its architectural artistry and historical significance. Can we then wonder at what I previously asserted, and, I trust, have since proved, that cathedral churches have become mere showplaces for the public and are considered only as sources of revenue by ecclesiastics? The neglected state of this once glorious church is a national disgrace. While tens of thousands are annually voted for comparatively trivial purposes, and hundreds of thousands have recently been spent on mere architectural deformities, not even a small grant has been proposed to keep the sepulchral monuments of our ancient kings in repair. It is quite surprising to see the utter apathy that exists among those who, by their birth and station, should be the legitimate conservators of our national antiquities. Where can we find another spot, not just in England, but in all of Europe, that contains so many splendid monuments of ancient art, made even more interesting by the historical associations connected with them? If we stand immediately behind the exquisite high altar screen, with its tabernacle work and curious imagery, we can see in one view the tombs of Edward I, invader of Scotland, Henry III, rebuilder of the vast abbey itself, the faithful and amiable Queen Eleanor, Henry V, the conqueror of France, Edward III and his Queen Philippa, King Richard II, and last but not least, the shrine of St. Edward. Although stripped of its rich and sumptuous ornaments, this shrine still holds the precious relics of the Holy Confessor, whose virtues have survived even the calumnies of the so-called Reformation and are still held up to our monarchs as models during their coronation ceremonies. The same observations apply to most of the other great churches. Westminster Abbey itself, arguably the finest edifice in the metropolis, is in a lamentable state of neglect and is continually being disfigured by the erection of inappropriate and tasteless monuments. Recently, when examining the interior of this magnificent church, I was utterly disgusted to see that the chapel of St. Paul had been half filled with a huge figure of James Watt, sitting in an armchair on an enormous square pedestal, adorned with tasteless ornaments. These ornaments, unlike any Greek or Roman foliage, were presumably intended to be Gothic. This eyesore is the work of Sir F. Chantrey. Surely, this figure must have been originally intended for the center of some grand terrace garden. It could never have been meant for the interior of the abbey. Its presence is so offensive that if Sir Francis did indeed design it for this location, he deserves to be crushed under its great pedestal to prevent him from committing such an atrocity against good taste again. But is this noble edifice to be forever blocked and mutilated by the continual erection of these most inappropriate and tasteless monuments? Do the dean and chapter not have sufficient authority to prevent their erection? What can we expect or hope for from them when they allow filthy dolls to be exhibited within the sacred walls to make the showplace more attractive to holiday visitors? Oh, spirits of the departed abbots, if only you could see this. The mighty buildings you raised, the tombs of the great men that lie within them, all this is not enough to attract the mob. So a set of puppets is added, the show draws in visitors, and the chapter collects the cash. Oh, vile desecration! And this occurs in the largest church of the metropolis, the mausoleum of our kings, a place of the highest interest because of its architectural artistry and historical significance. Can we, then, wonder at what I previously asserted, and, I trust, have since proved, that cathedral churches have become mere showplaces for the public and are considered only as sources of revenue by ecclesiastics? The neglected state of this once glorious church is a national disgrace. While tens of thousands are annually voted for comparatively trivial purposes, and hundreds of thousands have recently been spent on mere architectural deformities, not even a small grant has been proposed to keep the sepulchral monuments of our ancient kings in repair. It is quite surprising to see the utter apathy that exists among those who, by their birth and station, should be the legitimate conservators of our national antiquities. Where can we find another spot, not just in England, but in all of Europe, that contains so many splendid monuments of ancient art, made even more interesting by the historical associations connected with them? If we stand immediately behind the exquisite high altar screen with its tabernacle work and curious imagery, we can see in one view the tombs of Edward I, invader of Scotland, Henry III, rebuilder of the vast abbey itself, the faithful and amiable Queen Eleanor, Henry V, the conqueror of France, Edward III and his Queen Philippa, King Richard II, and last but not least, the shrine of St. Edward. Although stripped of its rich and sumptuous ornaments, this shrine still holds the precious relics of the Holy Confessor, whose virtues have survived even the calumnies of the so-called Reformation and are still held up to our monarchs as models during their coronation ceremonies. Through the arched chantry of Henry V, one can see the massive brazen gates and grand entrance to the monumental chapel of the 7th Henry, a matchless example of the latter style. Beyond the tombs I've described, the aisles and lateral chapels are filled with monumental effigies of ecclesiastical and noble personages, all celebrated in English chronicles and surpassing in beauty of execution. These are contained at the extreme end of a church of immense length, whose groined canopy reaches more than 100 feet from the tessellated pavement. This church's history is interwoven with that of the country itself, and should be dear to us from its religious, ancient, and national associations. It doesn't take an architect, antiquary, or artist to understand the vast claims which the Abbey of St. Peter's, Westminster, has upon our respect and veneration. If one possesses even a spark of love of country and pride of nation, they would view every stone of this noble structure with religious respect. Yet it's soul-sickening to see the class of people who come to inspect this church and the feelings with which they perambulate its sacred aisles. A mere flock of holiday visitors who come to London to see sights, taking the Abbey on their way to the Surrey Zoological Gardens. One might expect that, given its proximity to the Houses of Parliament, Catholic members would occasionally enter its sacred walls to imbibe some of the devotional spirit of ancient days, which its venerable architecture and sepulchral memorials can hardly fail to impart. This would be a small consolation and relief to a Catholic mind compelled to endure the noisy debates of political warfare. But I doubt these gentlemen have ever penetrated westward of Henry VII's chapel. The apathy of royalty towards this sacred fabric is truly melancholy. We hear much about the interest certain distinguished personages take in the performances of a learned monkey or equestrian evolutions, but they pay little regard to the resting place of their ancestors. Even if they refuse to contribute a small sum out of the thousands they annually squander on trifles toward the restoration of national monuments, a visit to the neglected and desecrated pile of Westminster might teach them the instructive lesson that departed royalty is easily forgotten. If the memory of great kings of England, who, by their personal valor and energy, achieved the most important victories and were foremost in camp and council, isn't enough to procure decent respect for their place of burial, then what extreme neglect must await those sovereigns whose lives are mere routines of fashionable luxury, their greatest achievement a pony drive, their principal occupation to dine. However, I acknowledge that there has been a significant improvement in recent years in the partial restorations of certain cathedrals and other churches concerning the accuracy of molding and detail. The mechanical aspects of Gothic architecture are now well understood. Still, it is the principles that influenced ancient compositions and the soul present in former works that are lamentably deficient. As I've stated before, these can only be regained through a restoration of ancient feelings and sentiments. Only these can restore pointed architecture to its former glorious state. Without them, all that is done will be a tame and heartless copy, true to the mechanics of the style, but utterly lacking the sentiment and feeling that distinguishes ancient design. This is why the modern alterations in the choirs of Peterborough and Norwich mentioned earlier are so ineffective. The details individually are accurate and well executed, but the principle of the design is so contrary to the ancient arrangement that the effect is detestable. The same can be said for Canterbury, where the restorations deserve honorable mention. A great deal of money has been spent, and I must add, judiciously. Indeed, the rebuilding of the northwestern tower is an undertaking worthy of ancient and better days. In these works, recutting moldings, pateras, bosses, and the repainting and gilding are excellently executed. But when we look at the new altar screen, we are astonished that with so much art in this vast church, a better idea wasn't suggested. It is meager and poor in the extreme, lacking any ancient sentiment, merely a succession of panels. This reflects modern feelings. When this church was used for ancient worship, the high altar was the focal point. It was for the continual sacrifice offered there that the church itself was raised. Neither gold, jewels, nor silver were spared in its decoration. Ancient artists, burning with zeal and devotion, expended their most glorious compositions and skill on it. The Mass was gorgeous and imposing, with each detail exquisite and appropriate. Such a design wasn't produced by multiplying panels until they reached across the choir, nor was it composed to back a common table. The artist felt the glory of the work he was called to compose. It was no less than erecting an altar for the most solemn rites of the church. The glorious nature of the subject inspired excellence and produced a splendid result. From such feelings, all ancient compositions emanated. Without them, pointed architecture can never rise beyond a mere copy of its mechanical aspects. There is no harmony between these grand structures and Protestant worship. The early proponents of the new doctrines were so aware of this that they directed their strongest criticisms and attacks against these edifices. While the new religion might fit the conventicles and meeting houses, it has no connection with the glories of ancient times. The modern Anglican establishment is the only system that retained the principle of cathedral establishments and episcopal jurisdiction. However, these remnants of ancient church government, mixed with modern opinions and temporal authority, have always been a subject of public outcry and could be dismantled by legislative action at any time. What then does the future hold? What new challenges and destruction might these unfortunate structures face? The mind recoils at the thought. Would they be walled up and divided into preaching houses for dissenters, Unitarians, and freethinkers as in Scotland? Would they be converted into factories or warehouses, like the churches of France during the Revolution of 1790? Or would they be left to decay, like many glorious buildings that perished at the change of religion, of which only a few crumbling arches remain? One of these outcomes is likely if the current establishment ceases to exist. There is a glimmer of hope, though, that before such a fate befalls these structures, enough devout and thoughtful individuals might return to Catholic unity, ready to protect these magnificent buildings and restore them to their former glory and worship. If we move beyond the cathedrals themselves to examine the surrounding ecclesiastical buildings, we find that the changes and destructions they have undergone to suit the whims of each new occupant are so extensive that it is difficult to trace anything of the original design. All the ancient characteristic features have been completely altered. As clergy abandoned ecclesiastical discipline for comfort, swapped old hospitality for formal visiting, and essentially became laymen in all but income and title, they found the old buildings unsuitable for their new lifestyles. What served the studious, retired priest or the hospitable and generous prelate of ancient times was very unfit for a married social clergyman or a modern bishop whose wife must adhere to fashionable life. As a result, bishops' palaces have either been torn down and rebuilt on a smaller scale, or their grandest features left to decay as useless parts of the building, with the inhabited parts repaired in the worst possible taste. Rectories and canonries have fared even worse. Many old buildings have been demolished entirely and replaced with ugly square structures. The private chapels have been demolished or repurposed. Old oak ceilings have been plastered over. Paneling has been removed or papered over. Mullioned windows have been replaced with common sashes, and plain brick buildings have been added to create large rooms for parties, with verandas and perhaps conservatories. These changes have rendered the canonries habitable for the 3 months' residence required. If we look at the buildings originally erected for the residence of the vicars attached to cathedrals, such as at Wells, we see a lamentable transformation. When these buildings were constructed, the vicars were a venerable body of priests living in a collegiate manner within their close. Each had a lodging or set of 2 chambers, a common hall for meals, and a chapel with a library of theological and historical works. All these buildings were beautifully designed, with significant additions from Bishop Beckington. The arrangement of this close and its connection to the cathedral by a cloister passing over a sumptuous gatehouse leading to the chapter house stair was so excellently managed that, despite the terrible repairs and mutilations it has suffered and its current degraded condition, it remains one of the most interesting specimens of ecclesiastical buildings attached to cathedrals. It offers a glimpse into the venerable character of ecclesiastical residences and their harmony with the structures they complemented. However, as soon as the influence of the new opinions took hold, this pious and scholarly abode experienced a fatal change. The number of vicars was reduced to less than a third of the original, and their lands were so pillaged that the ecclesiastical function was given to laymen whose only qualification was a minor skill in vocal music. The remaining meager income, insufficient to support dedicated clergy, enticed needy shopkeepers to leave their counters twice a day, rush through the service, and return to their half-served customers. When the buildings, funded by the munificence of Roger de Salopia and Thomas de Beckington, fell into the hands of such men, the result was predictable. They gradually sank into neglect and decay. The dwellings were rented to various tenants who altered them at will. The great hall was rented out for the performances of traveling entertainers or served as a dance academy. The library was of little use to these men, who needed only their shop account books and would repurpose ancient texts into parcel wrappers. Thus, it is no surprise that only a few odd leaves of manuscripts and some musty volumes remain of what must have been a valuable collection. The degradation reached such an extent that even the keeper of a public tavern became one of these lay vicars. This man, fresh from the punch bowl and tobacco smoke, with the noise of the taproom ringing in his ears, would rush from the bar to the choir, don a surplice, and perform the service, only to hurry back to his tavern as soon as it concluded. Given these disgraceful scenes, it is no wonder that the establishment has fallen into contempt. The often touted blessings and splendid results of the so-called Reformation are nowhere to be seen. The facts speak for themselves, showing how all classes of ecclesiastical buildings and persons have been ruined and degraded by the introduction of the current system. If space allowed, I could thoroughly show how damaging the effects of Protestantism were on art in the countries where it took root. Even in France, where Protestant influence lasted just a year, the havoc they wreaked saw the plundering and demolition of the Church's principal treasures and finest art. Whether we look at John Knox in Scotland, the Huguenots in France, the creators of the English establishment, or Cromwell's Puritans, we find that despite their differing schismatic views, they were united in their commitment to theft and destruction. To them, sanctity and art meant nothing. A thirst for gold and a love of destroying what they couldn't comprehend, mixed with savage fanaticism, drove them to commit appalling acts against both humanity and noble art. These destructive tendencies have somewhat subsided due to the lukewarm attitude toward religion in this country. Only a few years ago, the sight of a crucifix or Madonna would provoke greater outrage among the devout than the most obscene and filthy idol that paganism could produce. I believe that many within the dissenting sects would still rejoice in the destruction of every noble religious edifice and the elimination of all ecclesiastical authority. I must also comment on the current system of church and chapel building, which is so vile, mercenary, and disrespectful to the reverence and honor that should be paid to divine worship, that it deserves the harshest criticism. Among the greatest sins of our time is the attempt to see how cheaply religious buildings can be erected and how much profit can be made from renting pews. This commodification of sacred spaces is akin to the temple profanation that so angered our divine Redeemer that he cast out the polluters with whips. Today, church building has become a mere trade, devoid of the sanctity it once held. Architects and artisans no longer employ their finest skills. Instead, they aim to construct buildings as cheaply as possible, with every detail designed to match the lowest budget. We can understand the feelings with which the old churchmen undertook the erection of their churches by referring to the solemn office of dedication. The house which I am about to build will be great, for our God is greater than all gods. But who is able to build a house for him, since the heavens cannot contain him? Therefore, we prepare the necessary things with all our skill. The instructions of the church commissioners today are the complete opposite of these noble sentiments. They demand structures that are as plain and inexpensive as possible, with the sermon being the only part of the service considered. As a result, we have a proliferation of paltry churches that are a disgrace to the age, both in their design and the meager sums allocated for their construction. No consideration for propriety or fitness is given in their design. Some churches have porticos of Greek temples topped by poorly designed steeples. Others mix distorted Greek and Roman elements, creating offensive architectural monstrosities. In some cases, architects have tried to make the exterior look like an old pointed church, but once inside, it is clear that these buildings are just modern preaching houses, complete with galleries, pews, and other fittings. The result is a host of absurd and incongruous designs in modern places built for religious worship, highlighting the impossibility of creating a grand design suitable for the meagerness of the current worship practices. The style of chapels built on speculation is beneath criticism. These chapels are erected by individuals who weigh options, like investing in a mortgage, a railroad, or a chapel, based purely on which would yield the best return on investment. Once they decide to back a popular preacher known for dramatic sermons, they construct a basic building with 4 walls and windows, pack it full of seats, and rent them out. The greed doesn't stop there. They also create spacious, dry vaults beneath the chapel, which are soon leased at a high rent to wine and brandy merchants. I've already addressed the impiety of trading in religious edifices, but it bears repeating. Nothing incites the wrath of the Almighty more than exploiting religion for personal gain. In conclusion, while I would never suggest that prayers offered from a humble structure are any less sincere or acceptable than those from a grand edifice, when luxury is on the rise and wealth is more abundant than ever, the proliferation of cheap buildings for worship and the neglect of ancient churches show a profound lack of religious zeal. This indifference to the sanctity and glory of divine worship is as disgraceful to the nation as it is offensive to the Almighty. Conclusion: reflections on the probable state of the English churches, had this country remained in communion with the Catholic Church. Having demonstrated the disastrous effects of the Protestant or destructive principle on Catholic art and architecture in England, it is instructive to consider what might have happened to the ancient churches had Protestantism never been established in this country. Judging from the last 3 centuries on the continent, it is presumptuous to think that England alone would have escaped the pestilential influence of pagan ideas and tastes spreading across Europe during England's schism. Indications of this influence were already visible in the latter pointed erections. There is great reason to believe that if the destructive spirit had been suppressed, the restorative or classic rage would have been almost as detrimental to Catholic art. As it stands, everything glorious about English churches is Catholic. Everything debased and hideous is Protestant. This creates a melancholy superiority over foreign churches, which present a lamentable contrast between the ancient spirit and modern practices of Catholicism. Modern Catholics polluting and disfiguring their structures with pagan emblems and theatrical trumpery is as disheartening as seeing fine old Catholic churches used for Protestant services. The modern degeneracy of Catholic practices in Europe somewhat alleviates the sorrow felt over Protestant ravages. It is better to see the great abbeys of England ruined and roofless than degraded into mere revenue sources or luxurious abodes for a few nominal monks. Our English monasteries were cut off in their glory, amidst boundless hospitality and regular observance. Their venerable ruins breathe of faith, charity, contemplation, austerity, and prayer. We can visit these remains of ancient piety with unalloyed reverence and regret. However, the abbatial remains of France, mingled with pagan and Italian influences, tell a different story. So fatal has the rage for pagan novelties been to Christian art that the Old English churches have retained more of their original features than most on the continent. They have benefited from neglect and Protestant apathy, which are greater preservatives of antiquity than modern innovation or restoration. Salisbury Cathedral suffered more under Bishop Barrington's pretended restoration than during the 3 preceding centuries, including the reigns of Henry VIII, Edward VI, and Cromwell. It is often remarked how glorious these ancient churches would appear if restored to Catholic worship. While this would indeed be glorious, the ancient ideas and feelings have fallen to such a low ebb that it is doubtful whether there are enough English Catholics who would understand the real use of these vast edifices better than their Protestant possessors. Even if Catholics regained possession, there is a risk that choir screens would be demolished, stalls removed, and other barbarous innovations made. The buildings might be condemned as inconvenient and uncomfortable, compared to the new galleried assembly rooms used for Catholic worship today. A vast change must occur in the minds of many modern Catholics to make them worthy of these stupendous monuments of ancient piety. Heaven forbid that they should be restored to anything less than their former glory. Who could wish to see the cathedrals where a St. Thomas or a St. Hugh celebrated holy mysteries, now disgraced by modern semi-pagan altars and theatrical choirs? There is little sympathy between the present Catholic body in England and their glorious ancestors. They have often abandoned ancient traditions to follow the tide of innovations and paltry novelties. Worldly expedients started by Protestant sects are sometimes adopted, and modern deformities rise under the name of churches, often preferred to ancient models. The holy mysteries themselves have been used to raise temporary supplies, advertised as musical treats to attract paying audiences. While these practices may pass in today's charitable and commercial culture, they are far removed from ancient Catholic practices and attest to an awful state of degeneracy among those who should act on sound principles and avoid modern expediencies. The absence of solemnity in many modern Catholic buildings in England is so pronounced that a few crumbling walls and prostrate arches of a religious edifice from the days of faith convey a stronger religious impression than the actual service in many modern chapels. Taking these facts into consideration, as well as the prevailing rage for paganism during the last 3 centuries on the continent, I do not think the architecture of our English churches would have fared much better under a Catholic hierarchy. Beyond the almost certain destruction of every screen in England, we might have seen the lantern of Ely terminated by a miniature dome or a Doric portico fronting the nave of York. However, let no one imagine for a moment that the preservation of the choir screens and other ancient arrangements was due to any love or veneration for antiquity on the part of the Protestant clergy. The difference between them and their Catholic contemporaries is precisely this. The Protestants left many original features standing through indifference, while the Catholics removed them through a false idea of improvement. When Protestantism undertook renovations, it was often worse than their Catholic counterparts' extravagances, as it embodied the same wretched pagan ideas without the scale or richness of the foreign architecture of the same period. Buildings such as Queen's College, Oxford, the new quadrangle of Christ's Church, Radcliffe Library, and St. Paul's Cathedral, London, are utter departures from Catholic architecture and meager imitations of Italian paganism. It is fortunate for English architecture that during the greatest rage for classic art, the desire for church building was nearly extinct due to Protestant ascendancy. This neglect left many of our finest monuments comparatively safe, while the enthusiasm for the new style was diverted into mansions, palaces, and other structures for luxury and temporal splendor. I must address those who believe that by restoring the details and accessories of pointed architecture, they are reviving Catholic art. This is not the case. Unless the ancient arrangement is restored and the true principles carried out, all the elaborate details, moldings, pinnacles, tracery, are merely a disguise. It is a great profanation to dress Protestant monstrosities in the garb of Catholic antiquity. Pews and gallery fronts with tracery panels, reading desks with canopied tops, and carved communion tables may be intricate and costly, but unless a church is built on the traditional form, it will be a miserable failure. Even a follower of John Knox, as seen in the Scotch conventicle in London, may build a meeting house with pointed windows, arches, and good details, but they will always look like the scattered leaves of a precious volume bound up by an unskilled hand without connection or relation to their meaning. Applying these venerable forms to any but their real intention is a prostitution of this glorious style. A Catholic church requires more than pillars, arches, windows, screens, and niches. It demands a traditional arrangement. It needs a chancel set apart for sacrifice and screened off from the people, a stone altar, a sacrarium sedilia for the officiating priests, and an elevated rood loft from which the Holy Gospel may be chanted to the assembled faithful. It requires chapels for penance and prayer, a sacristy to contain the sacred vessels, a font for the Holy Sacrament of baptism, a southern porch for penitents and catechumens, a stoup for hallowed water, and a tower for bells. Unless a building destined for a church possesses all these requisites, it remains a modern conventicle, despite the correctness of its details, and cannot be considered a revival of Catholic art.
Thank you for joining us until the end of the book. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to our channel for similar content in the future.